On August 14, 1935, Franklin Roosevelt signed the act that created Social Security. The purpose of Social Security had nothing to do with any of the enumerated powers. A constitutional challenge was inevitable, and it came in the form of Helvering v. Davis, brought by a shareholder in the Edison Electric Illuminating Company, who wanted the courts to restrain the company from making the payments and deductions required by the Social Security Act. The Supreme Court handed down its ruling on May 24, 1937, holding that the Social Security Act was constitutional by explicitly reversing a judicial consensus about the meaning of a key phrase in the Constitution. The court thereby destroyed the limits on the federal government's spending authority. It was the most far-reaching decision since 1803, when the court asserted its right of judicial review in Marbury v. Madison. The history behind Helvering goes all the way back to the ratification debates of 1788. Among the potential loopholes that worried the anti-federalists was one that consisted of just two words: general welfare, used in the opening of Article 1, Section 8. Here is the exact wording of the relevant portion. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts, and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. After this preamble come 17 enumerated powers separated by semicolons. The anti-federalists fixated on the phrase general welfare, worrying that it could be interpreted to mean anything. When James Madison wrote Federalist No. 41, he answered that charge as definitively as anyone could, he being the man who had sat through every session of the Constitutional Convention and taken exhaustive notes on all of them. The plain sense of the text, said Madison, was to proclaim the federal government's power to tax and spend, and the rest of that opening clause of Article 1, Section 8 was a quick way to summarize what the taxes could be used for. Nothing is more natural nor common than first to use a general phrase and then to explain and qualify it by a recital of particulars, Adams wrote. The idea of an enumeration of particulars which neither explain nor qualify the general meaning and can have no other effect than to confound and mislead is an absurdity. For what purpose could the enumeration of particulars be inserted if these and all others were meant to be included in the preceding general power? For Madison, along with the other Federalists who defended the Constitution in the state ratifying conventions, the whole point of enumerating the powers of the federal government was to limit them to those enumerated powers. Let me emphasize that the debate was exclusively between the anti-federalists, who feared that general welfare would be interpreted as conferring a plenary power on Congress, and the Federalists, who said categorically that those fears were groundless. None of the leading Federalists in any of the ratifying conventions defended the notion that general welfare should be interpreted as conferring authority for Congress to do anything that advanced the general welfare. Not even Alexander Hamilton. How can this be, since Hamilton is constantly cited as evidence that some founders wanted a powerful federal government? Because when he wrote his own defense of the Constitution in the Federalist, Hamilton knew that to come out openly in favor of a broad interpretation of the General Welfare Clause would jeopardize ratification. He had openly acknowledged during the Constitutional Convention that no man's ideas were more remote from the plan of the Constitution than his were known to be. But he could not afford to say so during the ratification debates, hence the absence in the Federalist of any hint of his own wish that general welfare should be broadly interpreted. It was only in 1791, 2 years after the Constitution was safely ratified, that Hamilton introduced his Report on the Subject of Manufactures, which publicly expressed his position. If Hamilton had said in the Federalist what he said in 1791, Madison would have disassociated himself from Hamilton and made his case for the Constitution independently. The other founders also would have disassociated themselves from Hamilton. Among the major voices in the long process of ratification, Hamilton's view was unique. It is in that context that the Supreme Court ruled on the constitutionality of the Social Security Act in Helvering v. Davis. Justice Benjamin Cardozo, writing for a 7-2 majority, was conscious that the court was making history. He wrote with stunning bluntness, "Congress may spend money in aid of the general welfare. There have been great statesmen in our history who have stood for other views. We will not resurrect the contest. It is now settled by decision. The conception of the spending power advocated by Hamilton and strongly reinforced by Story has prevailed over that of Madison, which has not been lacking in adherents." It was over. Hamilton, whose opinions were the most extreme in the Constitutional Convention, who had not dared voice his true opinion about the General Welfare Clause during the ratification debates because it was so unpopular, and whose exposition of an expansive interpretation of the General Welfare Clause post-dated the ratification of the Constitution by 2 years, had been declared the right and true interpreter of what the founders had in mind. The court, having trashed the enumerated powers, then managed to make matters worse. Cardozo acknowledged that defining what constitutes general welfare is a matter of discretion. "The discretion, however, is not confided to the courts," he continued. "The discretion belongs to Congress, unless the choice is clearly wrong, a display of arbitrary power, not an exercise of judgment. Congress could spend on pretty much whatever it wished that it deemed to be for the general welfare, as long as it wasn't completely outlandish. As subsequent years were to prove, even completely outlandish could be okay. And so the accepted interpretation of general welfare was overturned in a stroke, without apology, and even with a sort of flippancy about the enormity of the reinterpretation that 7 individuals had imposed on the nation's founding document.